What kind of beginning produces a man who will one day set the world on fire? How does a child born in an ordinary house in a quiet border town grow into a leader whose decisions would bring war, destruction, and death on a scale never seen before? To understand Adolf Hitler, we cannot start with speeches, armies, or politics. We must begin with the town he was born in, the family he came from, the schools he attended, the dreams he held, and the failures that crushed him before the world even knew his name. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in the Austrian town of Braunau am Inn. This was a small settlement, home to roughly 3,000 people, where life moved slowly. Braunau sat directly on the border with Germany, divided only by the river Inn. On one side of the river lay Austria, on the other Bavaria, one of Germany's southern states. Towns like Braunau were quiet and provincial. Families lived in modest homes, traded in the local market, and most people never traveled far beyond their region. Children attended basic village schools, fathers worked in farming or government service, and mothers managed the household. Nothing about Braunau stood out as unusual, except that it became the birthplace of a boy who would one day dominate headlines and history books around the world. The house where Adolf was born still stands today, a plain two-story building with simple windows and a modest entrance. In 1889, it was just another rental property. Adolf's father, Alois Hitler, had moved there because of his job. Alois was born in 1837. His own early life was complicated. He was the illegitimate child of Maria Anna Schickler-Gruber. For most of his life, he carried her surname, Schickler-Gruber, until 1876, when at nearly 40 years old, he legally changed his name to Hitler after Johann Georg Hiedler was declared his father in official documents. That spelling, Hitler, was a bureaucratic error, but it stuck. History would later remember that name with infamy. By the time Adolf was born, Alois had established himself in the Austrian civil service. He was a customs officer, a stable government career that gave him authority and social standing. He was ambitious, intelligent, and practical, but he was also known to be strict, demanding, and at times harsh, particularly toward his family. At home, he expected discipline and obedience. Adolf's mother, Clara Podsel, born in 1860, was very different in character. She had come from a farming family and had once worked in Alois's household as a maid before marrying him in 1885 as his third wife. She was 23 years younger than Alois. Clara was quiet, deeply religious, and tender. She devoted herself to her children and gave them affection and care. To Adolf, she became the center of love and comfort in his early life. Adolf was one of 6 children born to Alois and Clara, but only 2 survived into adulthood. Adolf himself and his younger sister Paula. Infant mortality was common in the late 19th century. Diseases that are easily treated today, like diphtheria, scarlet fever, and pneumonia, often killed children at the time. The deaths of several of her children made Clara especially protective of the ones who survived. She poured her care into Adolf, perhaps giving him more indulgence than he otherwise would have received. From the very beginning, Adolf grew up under 2 opposing parental influences. His father, Alois, represented authority, rules, and ambition. His mother, Clara, represented warmth, comfort, and unconditional affection. This clash shaped Adolf's childhood. He often resisted his father's discipline, but he clung to his mother's love. Adolf's early schooling reflected his personality. Teachers saw that he was intelligent and capable, but he was inconsistent. In subjects that interested him, such as drawing, reading, and history, he did well. In subjects he disliked, particularly mathematics and science, he neglected his studies. He was stubborn, proud, and resistant to correction. He sometimes argued with teachers instead of quietly obeying. Reports from his schools describe him as gifted in imagination, but lacking in discipline. Drawing was his passion. From a young age, he filled notebooks with sketches of houses, churches, and landscapes. He loved to study buildings and copy their designs. He dreamed of one day becoming an artist, perhaps even a famous painter or architect. He imagined studying at the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, the empire's capital. But this dream clashed with his father's wishes. Alois wanted Adolf to follow a secure path in government service. He dismissed art as a waste of time. He tried to force Adolf into more practical studies, which led to frequent arguments between them. Adolf resisted, refusing to put effort into subjects he disliked. Their relationship grew strained. In 1903, when Adolf was 14, his father, Alois, died suddenly of a lung hemorrhage. The family lost both its authority figure and its main source of income. With Alois gone, the household was left under Clara's care. She encouraged Adolf's interest in art, allowing him to dream of an artistic career. But tragedy struck again in 1907. Clara developed breast cancer. Medical knowledge at the time was limited, and treatments were painful and often ineffective. She was treated by Dr. Eduard Bloch, a Jewish physician in Linz, who later remembered Adolf's devotion to his mother during her illness. Despite treatment, Clara died in December 1907. Adolf was 18 years old. Her death devastated him. He had been deeply attached to her, and now he was left an orphan, with no parents to guide him. After his mother's death, Adolf moved to Vienna to pursue his dream of becoming an artist. Vienna was one of Europe's greatest cities. It had nearly 2 million residents at the time, making it the fourth largest city in the world. Vienna was famous for its grand architecture along the Ringstrasse, its opera houses, its theaters, and its vibrant cafe culture, where writers, artists, and intellectuals gathered. But it was also a city of contrasts. While the upper classes lived in luxury, many working-class families crowded into small apartments. Poverty, inequality, and social tension were common. Vienna was also politically charged. Nationalist movements, socialist movements, and anti-Semitic groups were all active. Mayor Karl Lueger, elected multiple times, was known for his anti-Jewish rhetoric, which gained him significant popularity. Vienna's diversity, Germans, Czechs, Hungarians, Jews, and others, made it both culturally rich and socially divided. Adolf applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna in 1907. The academy was highly competitive. Applicants had to submit portfolios with drawings of people, buildings, and composition. The judges rejected his application, noting that while his architectural sketches were adequate, his human figures were poor. They suggested he study architecture, but without a secondary school diploma, he was ineligible. He tried again in 1908 but failed once more. The rejections crushed his hope of becoming a professional painter. Now, without parents and without a career, he fell into poverty. He lived in cheap lodging houses, sometimes in shelters for the homeless. He earned money by painting postcards and watercolors of Vienna's landmarks, selling them to tourists and small shops. His income was meager. He often ate poorly and sometimes went hungry. During these difficult years, Adolf spent much of his free time in libraries and reading rooms. He read books on history, philosophy, architecture, and politics. He devoured newspapers and followed debates. He listened to speeches in the streets. Vienna's political climate left a deep impression on him. He saw how leaders like Karl Lueger used strong rhetoric to attract followers, and he absorbed many nationalist and anti-Semitic ideas circulating at the time. By 1913, Adolf had been in Vienna for several years, but his life had not improved. He was 24 years old, still painting small postcards for survival, still living in cheap rooms, and still without a clear career. He had failed twice to enter the art academy. He was increasingly bitter and frustrated. That year, he decided to leave Vienna. In May 1913, he moved to Munich, a city in Germany. Officially, he left partly to avoid conscription into the Austrian army, but he also admired Germany more than Austria. He believed Germany was stronger, more unified, and more in line with his identity as a German-speaking nationalist. This move would place him directly in the path of history, because just 1 year later, in the summer of 1914, the First World War broke out for Adolf Hitler, who until then had lived as a failed artist and an isolated young man. The war would provide something he had never known before: belonging, purpose, and identity. The turning point came in the summer of On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Franz Ferdinand was the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph and next in line to the throne of the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire. His position made him a symbol of imperial authority. Sarajevo was part of Bosnia, which had been annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908. This angered Serbia, a small Slavic kingdom just south of Bosnia. Serbia wanted to unite all Slavs under its own leadership, and nationalist groups there resented Austria's rule over fellow Slavs in Bosnia. On the day of the assassination, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were traveling through Sarajevo in an open car when a group of conspirators, members of a Serbian nationalist organization called the Black Hand, carried out their plan. After an earlier attempt failed, a young man named Gavrilo Princip stepped forward and shot both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie at close range. They died within minutes. This event, though involving only a handful of men, triggered the First World War. Austria-Hungary, supported by Germany, declared war on Serbia. Russia, bound to protect Serbia, declared war on Austria-Hungary. Germany declared war on Russia, and then on Russia's ally, France. Germany invaded Belgium in order to reach France quickly, and this brought Britain into the war. Within a matter of weeks, most of Europe's major powers were at war. The war became a conflict unlike anything Europe had ever seen. It was called the Great War at the time because of its scale. The armies mobilized were enormous. Germany put more than 13 million men into uniform during the conflict. France mobilized 8 million, Austria-Hungary 7.8 million, Britain 8.9 million, Russia 12 million. In total, more than 65 million soldiers fought in the First World War. The war was not only fought in Europe, it spread to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, involving colonies and overseas territories. But for Adolf Hitler, the decisive experience would be the Western Front, the line of battle that stretched across Belgium and northern France. When the war broke out, huge crowds gathered in city squares. In Munich, people cheered, sang patriotic songs, and waved flags. They believed the war would be short, perhaps over in just a few months. Newspapers printed slogans of honor and sacrifice. For many, the war was not a disaster, but an adventure, a chance to serve the nation and prove loyalty. For Adolf Hitler, this was a moment of destiny. He had no family, no career, and no real place in society. But now, suddenly, there was a cause greater than himself. On August 3rd, 1914, the day Germany declared war on France, he petitioned to join the Bavarian army. Normally, as an Austrian citizen, he should have been turned away, but the authorities accepted him, perhaps because of the flood of volunteers, or perhaps because he insisted so passionately. For Hitler, this was the beginning of his transformation from an isolated man to a soldier. He was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, known as the List Regiment after its commander, Colonel Julius von List. He trained briefly before being sent to Belgium in October. The Battle of Ypres in late 1914 was his regiment's baptism of fire. Ypres, a town in Belgium, became the site of intense fighting as the German army tried to break through Allied lines. The casualties were horrific. By the end of the battle, the List regiment had lost more than 2,000 men out of 3,600. Hitler survived, and this survival in the midst of massive death gave him a sense of fate. He believed he had been spared for a reason. Life on the Western Front soon settled into a grim routine of trench warfare. The Germans and the Allies dug long, deep trenches stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Between the trenches lay no man's land, a deadly zone of mud, barbed wire, shell craters, and corpses. Soldiers lived for weeks or months in these trenches. The conditions were dreadful. Mud often reached waist level. In wet weather, rats infested the dugouts, feeding on leftover food and even the dead. Lice were constant, causing itching and disease. Fresh food was scarce, and soldiers ate mostly bread, canned meat, and watery soup. Clean water was hard to get, and dysentery spread quickly. The smell of unwashed bodies, latrines, and decaying corpses filled the air. Artillery bombardments shook the ground day and night. Soldiers lived with constant fear of being shelled, shot, or gassed. The weapons of the war made it more deadly than any before. The machine gun, capable of firing up to 600 rounds per minute, could cut down entire waves of attacking soldiers in seconds. Heavy artillery fired shells weighing hundreds of pounds, capable of destroying trenches and killing dozens at once. Poison gas, chlorine, phosgene, and later mustard gas caused choking, blindness, and burns. Soldiers wore gas masks, but many still died in agony. Airplanes were used for reconnaissance and later for bombing. Tanks, introduced in 1916, could cross trenches and barbed wire, though they were slow and unreliable at first. In this environment, Hitler served as a dispatch runner. His job was to carry messages between headquarters and the front lines. This required running through dangerous areas under fire. It was one of the most dangerous assignments, as runners were often exposed. Hitler, however, performed his duties with commitment. He was considered reliable, and his officers praised his bravery. In 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, Hitler was wounded in the leg by shrapnel from an artillery shell. The Battle of the Somme was one of the deadliest of the war. Fought between July and November 1916, it caused more than 1 million casualties. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered 57,000 casualties, the heaviest single-day loss in its history. Hitler recovered in hospital and returned to his regiment. For his service, he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 and the Iron Cross First Class in 1918. The First Class was rarely given to someone of his rank. It was usually reserved for officers, but his reliability as a runner earned him the decoration. He also received the Black Wound Badge for being injured. These medals became his most prized possessions, and he wore them throughout his later political career. In October 1918, as the war neared its end, Hitler was caught in a British mustard gas attack near Ypres. He was temporarily blinded and sent to a military hospital in Passauer, northern Germany. While recovering, he received the news that Germany had asked for an armistice. On November 11, 1918, the war ended. Germany had lost. The empire of Kaiser Wilhelm II collapsed, and the Kaiser fled to the Netherlands. The new government, later called the Weimar Republic, signed the peace terms. Hitler was devastated. For him, the defeat was a betrayal. The German army, still on foreign soil and not yet overrun, had been forced to surrender. In June 1919, the German government signed the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty was harsh. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war. Under Article 2031, the so-called War Guilt Clause, it had to give up 13% of its European territory, including Alsace-Lorraine, to France, large parts of Prussia to the new state of Poland, and other lands to Belgium and Denmark. It lost all of its overseas colony. Its military was reduced to 100,000 men, forbidden from having tanks, aircraft, or submarines. The Rhineland, a key industrial region, was to be demilitarized. On top of this, Germany had to pay reparations to the Allies, eventually fixed at 32 billion gold marks, an enormous sum. To many Germans, the treaty was a humiliation. They called it the Diktat, meaning a dictated peace. Demonstrations erupted. Veterans felt betrayed. The idea spread that Germany had been stabbed in the back by weak politicians, socialists, communists, and Jews, not truly defeated in the field. Hitler, who had already embraced this belief while in hospital, now held it as a central truth. After the war, Hitler remained in the army for a time. The German military, reduced and restricted by the treaty, still held influence. In Munich, where Hitler was stationed, the political situation was volatile. Bavaria, the region of which Munich was the capital, had briefly declared itself a socialist republic in 1919. Following the Russian Revolution's example, communist groups took control, though only for a short time, before being crushed by right-wing paramilitary forces called the Freikorps, made up of ex-soldiers. Violence between left-wing and right-wing groups was frequent, with shootings, demonstrations, and assassination. Hitler's army unit assigned him to political education courses and propaganda duties. He attended lectures where nationalist, anti-communist, and anti-Semitic ideas were taught. He was also tasked with spying on small political groups in Munich to report on their activities. In September 1919, during one of these assignments, Hitler attended a meeting of a small group called the German Workers' Party, DAP. It had only a few dozen members. Its founder, Anton Drexler, was a locksmith who promoted nationalism, anti-Semitism, and opposition to both capitalism and Marxism. During the meeting, Hitler spoke out passionately against a comment he disagreed with. His speaking ability impressed Drexler, who invited him to join. On September 12, 1919, Adolf Hitler became a member of the German Workers' Party. At first, this seemed like a minor event. The DEP was just one of many tiny parties in post-war Munich. But for Hitler, it was the turning point of his life. In this group, he found a platform for his ideas and discovered his greatest talent, the ability to speak and move crowds. Hitler quickly rose in the party. By 1920, he was one of its most active members. That year, the party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDR, better known as the Nazi Party. Hitler helped draft its program, a set of 25 points. These included the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, the demand to unite all Germans in one nation, the demand for more land, or Lebensraum, living space, to support Germany's population, citizenship to be granted only to people of German blood, excluding Jews, strong central government authority over the economy and society. The Nazi Party was still small, but Hitler's speeches began to attract attention. He spoke in beer halls, where workers and veterans gathered. His style was emotional, direct, and fiery. He denounced the treaty, blamed Germany's problems on Jews and communists, and promised to restore national pride. He understood how to use simple slogans, repetition, and passion to win over listeners. Crowds grew larger, and donations began to come in. In 1921, Hitler became the party's chairman. He also oversaw the creation of a paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, SA, known as the Brown Shirts because of their uniform color. The SA protected Nazi meetings, intimidated opponents, and clashed with communists in the streets. It gave the party a sense of power and discipline. Munich in the early 1920s was fertile ground for Hitler's rise. Bavaria was full of right-wing groups, hostile to the Weimar Republic. Many people there supported restoring the monarchy or creating a nationalist dictatorship. Hitler's speeches made him stand out among dozens of agitators. He spoke of betrayal, revenge, and national rebirth. For veterans who felt lost, and for citizens angry at hyperinflation and poverty, his words struck a chord. By 1923, Germany faced another crisis. The government could not keep up with reparations payments, and French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. German workers went on strike in protest. To support them, the government printed more money. This led to hyperinflation, one of the worst in history. The value of money collapsed. In 1919, $1 was worth 4 German marks. By 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Prices rose daily, even hourly. People carried banknotes in wheelbarrows. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark before the war cost billions of marks by November 1923. Middle-class families saw their life savings wiped out. Businesses collapsed, and hunger spread. Amid this chaos, Hitler and the Nazis saw their chance. Inspired by Benito Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922, which brought the fascists to power in Italy, Hitler decided to attempt a similar coup in Bavaria. On the night of November 8, 1923, Hitler and 600 SA men stormed into a large beer hall in Munich, where Bavarian officials were holding a meeting. Firing shots into the ceiling, Hitler declared that a national revolution had begun. He forced local leaders at gunpoint to pledge support. The next day, Hitler and about 2,000 supporters marched through Munich, hoping to seize power, but the police and army remained loyal to the state. They blocked the marchers and opened fire. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. The coup attempt collapsed in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Hitler was arrested 2 days later and charged with treason. His trial, held in early 1924, gave him a national platform. He used it skillfully. Instead of denying his actions, he claimed he was a patriot, trying to save Germany. Newspapers reported his speeches, spreading his name across the country. Instead of destroying him, the trial made him famous. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but served only 9 months. He was sent to Landsberg prison, where conditions were comfortable compared to ordinary jails. He received visitors, wrote letters, and began dictating his ideas to his loyal follower, Rudolf Hess. These writings became the book Mein Kampf, My Struggle. In Mein Kampf, Hitler set out his worldview. He argued that history was a struggle between races. The Jews were the main enemy of Germany, and that communism was part of a Jewish conspiracy. He wrote that Germany needed to expand eastward to gain living space for its people. He emphasized the importance of propaganda and the need for strong, dictatorial leadership. At the time, Mein Kampf did not sell widely, but later, as Hitler rose to power, it became central to Nazi ideology. Hitler was released from prison in December 1924. By then, Germany's crisis had eased. A new currency, the Rentenmark, had ended hyperinflation. The economy began to stabilize with foreign loans. The Nazi Party, banned after the putsch, was allowed to reorganize. Hitler decided that the path to power would no longer be through violent uprising, but through legal, political means, elections, propaganda, and organization. By the end of 1924, Hitler was still not a major national figure. The Nazi Party remained small, with only tens of thousands of members compared to millions in larger parties. But he had gained recognition across Germany, written a book outlining his goals, and learned important lessons. Failure could be turned into opportunity if it was presented as patriotism. The failed coup had, paradoxically, laid the foundation for his eventual rise. The failed coup had, paradoxically, laid the foundation for his eventual rise. When Adolf Hitler left Landsberg prison in December 1924, he stepped into a Germany that was no longer burning with the same chaos that had marked the early years of the Weimar Republic. Hyperinflation had been tamed, the economy had begun to stabilize, and for the moment, the political storms that had swept across Bavaria and Berlin seemed to have calmed. But beneath this surface of recovery, the wounds of war, defeat, and humiliation remained deep. Hitler, far from abandoning his ambitions after the collapse of the Beer Hall Putsch, had refined them. He now believed that the path to power in Germany would not come from a direct seizure by force, but through patient maneuvering, legal methods, and the gradual building of a movement that would be strong enough to take control of the state from within. Germany, in 1925, was a republic still struggling for legitimacy. The Weimar Constitution, created in 1919, had given Germany a parliamentary democracy with universal suffrage, including the right for women to vote for the first time. But the constitution also contained weaknesses. The president was given extraordinary powers, including the ability to rule by emergency decree under Article 48. These powers, meant as a safeguard, would later be exploited by Hitler himself. At the same time, the Republic was plagued by enemies on both the left and the right. Meanwhile, Germany's economy entered a period of recovery. The Dawes Plan of 1924, arranged by American banker Charles Dawes, restructured Germany's reparations payments and brought in loans from the United States. German factories restarted, unemployment dropped, and foreign investment flowed in. Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich saw cultural blossoming. Modern art, jazz clubs, cinema, and new architecture, these years often remembered as the Golden Twenties, gave the impression that the Republic might finally stabilize. But stability was deceptive, for it rested heavily on foreign loans, particularly from the United States. When the American stock market crashed in October 1929, the shockwaves hit Germany harder than almost any other country. The flow of loans stopped, businesses went bankrupt, and unemployment soared. By 1930, more than 3 million Germans were without work. By 1932, the number reached 6 million, nearly 1 in 3 workers. Families lost their homes. Middle-class savings were wiped out. Farmers faced foreclosure, and long lines formed at soup kitchens. The despair of the Depression destroyed faith in the Republic. In this environment, Hitler's message suddenly found fertile ground. For years he had been speaking of betrayal, humiliation, and the need for national rebirth. Now, as unemployment and hunger spread, more and more Germans listened. The results were dramatic. In the Reichstag elections of 1930, the Nazi Party leapt from 12 seats to 10-7, making it the second largest party. 2 years later, in July 1932, they reached their peak, winning 230 seats out of 608, the largest party in parliament. Millions of Germans had turned to Hitler, not just the unemployed, but also middle-class shopkeepers, farmers, students, and professionals who feared communism and saw the Nazis as defenders of order. Hitler's rise was not just about words, it was about image and organization. The Nazis used modern propaganda techniques. Posters showed Hitler as a strong leader with slogans like Hitler über Deutschland, Hitler over Germany. Airplanes carried him to rallies across the country, giving him the aura of a modern statesman. Torchlight, parades, flags, uniforms, and marches created a sense of unity and discipline. The SA, by 1932, numbering more than 400,000 men, filled the streets, projecting strength, but also intimidating opponents. The Nazis became not just a party, but a movement that gave its followers identity and purpose. Despite their electoral success, Hitler was not immediately given power. Germany was still a republic, and the Chancellor was appointed by the President. The President at the time was Paul von Hindenburg, an old war hero. Hindenburg disliked Hitler, referring to him dismissively as that Austrian corporal. The conservative elites, army generals, industrialists, and aristocrats were wary of Hitler's radical rhetoric. They believed he was dangerous, unpredictable, and beneath them socially. But political deadlock forced their hand. No stable government could be formed without the Nazis, and the Depression made governing more urgent. In the presidential election of 1932, Hitler ran directly against Hindenburg. Hindenburg won with 53%. Hitler received nearly 37%, and the communist candidate about 10%. The results showed that Hitler had millions of followers. He was no longer a fringe agitator. In November 1932, the Nazis lost some seats, falling to 19-6, and some thought their rise was over. But the political elite was desperate to end the stalemate. Conservative politicians like Franz von Papen and Alfred Hugenberg believed they could use Hitler. They thought they could bring him into government as chancellor, surround him with experienced conservative ministers, and control him while using his popularity to stabilize the Republic. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He had finally reached the highest office in the land, but in reality, his position was not yet secure. His government was a coalition, made up not only of Nazis, but also of conservative allies who believed they could control him. Out of 11 ministers in the cabinet, only 3 were Nazis. The others belonged to traditional conservative parties. President Hindenburg, now 85 years old, still held the power to dismiss him. Many Germans assumed that Hitler's government would be short-lived, just one more in the long list of unstable administrations of the Weimar Republic. Few realized that within a year, Germany would no longer be a democracy at all. Hitler understood that he needed to act quickly. He did not intend to be just another chancellor. His goal was to establish complete control over Germany, eliminate opposition, and create a dictatorship. The opportunity to begin this transformation came only weeks after he took office. On the night of February 27, 1933, the German Parliament building, the Reichstag, was set on fire. Flames engulfed the building in Berlin, and firefighters battled the blaze for hours. The next day, the police arrested a young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe, who was found at the scene. The Nazis immediately declared that this was proof of a communist plot to overthrow the government. Hitler and his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, used the fire to spread fear of revolution. The very next day, President Hindenburg, at Hitler's urging, signed the Reichstag fire decree. This decree suspended many basic rights guaranteed by the Constitution, including freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, and the right to privacy in communications. It also allowed the government to arrest people without specific charges and to ban organizations deemed dangerous. Within days, thousands of communists, socialists, and other opponents were arrested. Newspapers critical of the Nazis were shut down. The Reichstag fire gave Hitler the excuse to begin dismantling democracy under the cover of legality. The next step was the March 1933 election. Hitler hoped to win a clear majority for the Nazis. The campaign was violent. The SA and police intimidated voters. Opposition newspapers were silenced, and communist candidates were jailed. Even so, the Nazis did not win an outright majority, receiving 43.9% of the vote and 288 seats in the Reichstag. But with the support of their conservative allies, they controlled a majority. On March 23, 1933, the new Reichstag met in the Kroll Opera House. Since the Reichstag building was still damaged, surrounded by SA men and under immense pressure, members of parliament voted on the Enabling Act, which gave the government the power to pass laws without the Reichstag or the president. This effectively gave Hitler dictatorial authority. Only the Social Democrats voted against it. The Communists could not, since most of them had been arrested. The Enabling Act passed with 2/3 support, marking the legal end of parliamentary democracy in Germany. With this law, Hitler had the power to govern by decree. Over the following months, he moved quickly to eliminate all opposition. Trade unions were banned in May 1933, replaced by the Nazi-controlled German Labour Front. Political parties were dissolved, and by July 1933, the Nazi Party was declared the only legal party in Germany. Regional governments in the states were taken over by Nazi appointees, eliminating local autonomy. By the end of 1933, Germany had become a one-party dictatorship. Violence was also used to secure power. In June 1934, Hitler turned against some of his own supporters in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. Leaders of the SA, including Ernst Röhm, had hoped to replace the regular army with their mass paramilitary force. Hitler, needing the support of the army and fearing Röhm's power, ordered a purge. Over several days, Rome and dozens of others were executed without trial. This showed that Hitler was willing to kill even his allies if they posed a threat. The army, reassured by the elimination of the SA leadership, pledged loyalty to Hitler. In August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler combined the offices of Chancellor and President, declaring himself Führer and Reichschancellor. The army was required to swear an oath of personal loyalty to him. This marked the final step in Hitler's consolidation of power. From this moment, there was no higher authority in Germany than Adolf Hitler. While eliminating political opponents, Hitler also set out to reshape German society according to Nazi ideology. In April 1933, a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses was organized. Soon after, laws excluded Jews from civil service jobs, universities, and the profession. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jews. These laws institutionalized racial discrimination, defining Jewish identity not by religion, but by ancestry. Jews became second-class citizens in their own country. The regime also targeted other groups: political dissidents, communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and people with disabilities were persecuted. Concentration camps, beginning with Dachau in 1933, were established to imprison those considered enemies of the state. At first, these camps held mostly political prisoners, but they soon expanded to include Jews and others. Propaganda was central to consolidating control. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, oversaw newspapers, radio, films, and posters. The Nazis used mass rallies, such as the annual gatherings in Nuremberg, to display power and unity. Radio sets were distributed widely so that Hitler's speeches could reach millions of homes. The regime sought to control not only politics, but also culture, education, and even leisure. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls indoctrinated children. The Strength Through Joy program organized vacations, concerts, and activities to promote Nazi ideals. At the same time, Hitler worked to rebuild the German economy and military. Unemployment, which had been over 6 million in 1933, dropped rapidly as public works projects, including the construction of the Autobahn highway system, and rearmament programs created jobs. By 1936, unemployment was less than 1 million. Rearmament, though forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles, was carried out secretly at first and then openly. The army was expanded, new weapons developed, and conscription reintroduced in foreign policy also played a role in strengthening Hitler's position. In 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations. In 1936, German troops reoccupied the Rhineland, which the Treaty of Versailles had declared demilitarized. This move was risky, but the Allies did not respond with force. In the same year, Hitler formed alliances with Fascist Italy under Mussolini and Imperial Japan, beginning the Axis partnership. By the end of the 1930s, Hitler's regime had consolidated total control within Germany and begun to challenge the international order established after World War I. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, greeted by cheering crowds in Vienna. Later that year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a German-speaking population. At the Munich conference in September 1938, Britain and France, seeking to avoid war, agreed to let Germany take the Sudetenland. Hitler promised it was his last territorial demand, but in March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, breaking his promise. By early 1939, Adolf Hitler had transformed Germany from a fragile democracy into a powerful dictatorship. He had eliminated political opponents, passed laws that excluded Jews and other minorities from German society, rebuilt the military in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, and annexed both Austria and Czechoslovakia without firing a major shot. Each success had emboldened him. Each gamble that went unchallenged by Britain or France convinced him that the world would continue to retreat rather than resist. But while his earlier moves could still be explained as the correction of past injustices, what came next would plunge the world into a war of unprecedented scale. The next target was Poland. In Hitler's mind, Poland stood in the way of his long-term goals. He had written in Mein Kampf about the need for Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. This meant expanding eastward into Eastern Europe and eventually the Soviet Union. Poland was the first barrier to this vision. It also contained territory that had once belonged to Germany before the Treaty of Versailles, including the city of Danzig, today Gans, and the Polish corridor, which separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Hitler hoped, as he had in Austria and Czechoslovakia, that Britain and France would not intervene. But this time, the Allies had reached their limit. After Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, breaking his promise at Munich, Britain and France declared they would guarantee Poland's independence. If Germany attacked Poland, they would respond with war. Hitler prepared anyway, but he faced one problem. If he invaded Poland, he risked a two-front war, with France and Britain attacking from the west and the Soviet Union from the east. To solve this, he made a shocking diplomatic move. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers of the two countries. Officially, it was a non-aggression treaty, promising that the two powers would not attack each other. Secretly, it contained a protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be split between them, with Germany taking the west and the Soviets the east. The pact stunned the world, as Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union had been bitter ideological enemies, but for Hitler it ensured that he could invade Poland without fear of Soviet resistance. On the morning of September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The attack came without a formal declaration of war. German planes bombed Polish cities, railways, and roads, while tanks and infantry crossed the borders in multiple directions. Hitler justified the invasion with propaganda, claiming that Poland had attacked Germany first. To make this lie more convincing, the Nazis staged a false flag operation known as the Gleiwitz Incident, where German operatives dressed in Polish uniforms attacked a German radio station near the border. The German attack was swift and overwhelming. This was the first demonstration of what became known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. The strategy combined fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, and air support to break through enemy defenses and encircle them. Within days, the Polish army was in retreat. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, in accordance with the secret agreement. By the end of September, Poland was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. Warsaw had fallen, and the Polish state was destroyed. On September 1, 1939, 2 days after the German invasion began, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had officially begun. Yet in the West, for several months, little happened. While Germany occupied Poland, Britain and France prepared for war, but made no immediate attack. This period, from late 1939 to early 1940, became known as the Phony War. Behind the lines, however, Germany prepared for its next move. Hitler's attention turned to Western Europe. The German military planned to strike quickly before Britain and France could organize. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, securing vital resources, especially iron ore from Sweden, that traveled through Norwegian ports. Both countries fell quickly, despite some resistance. The main attack came in May 1940, when Germany launched a massive assault on France and the Low Countries. German forces invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, drawing Allied armies north. Then German tanks and infantry pushed through the Ardennes. a forested region thought impassable to large armies, and broke into France behind the Allied lines. The speed of the German advance shocked the world. Within 6 weeks, France, one of Europe's strongest powers, collapsed. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. On June 22, France signed an armistice, leaving northern and western France under German occupation, while a collaborationist government was established in Vichy in the south. Britain now stood alone. Hitler hoped that Britain would make peace, but Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had taken office in May 1940, refused. The Battle of Britain began in the summer of 1940, as the German Luftwaffe launched a campaign to gain air superiority in preparation for an invasion of Britain. For months, German bombers targeted airfields, radar stations, and cities. In September, the Blitz began, nightly bombing raids on London and other cities. But the Royal Air Force, using radar and superior tactics, resisted. By October, Germany had failed to gain control of the skies, and the invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. Meanwhile, Hitler prepared for his true goal, expansion eastward. In 1941, he made the decision to attack the Soviet Union, breaking the non-aggression pact. But before this, in the spring of 1941, Germany expanded further. German forces occupied Yugoslavia, and Greece, after political instability threatened Axis influence in the Balkans. In North Africa, German troops under General Erwin Rommel supported Italy in its campaign against British forces, beginning the famous Desert Battle. The invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was launched on June 22. Nearly 3 million German soldiers, supported by hundreds of thousands of troops from Italy, Romania, Hungary, and other allies, crossed a front stretching more than 1,800 miles. The plan was to destroy the Soviet Union in a few months, capturing Moscow, Leningrad, and the rich resources of Ukraine. At first, the attack was devastatingly successful. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Millions of prisoners were taken. By autumn, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow and surrounded Leningrad, but the Soviet Union did not collapse. The vast distances, the stubborn resistance of Soviet soldiers, and the harsh Russian winter slowed the Germans. The war in the East would become the bloodiest conflict in human history, but by the end of 1941, Hitler had committed Germany to a war on a scale far greater than he had ever fought before. While battles raged abroad, Nazi policies at home grew even more extreme. From 1939 onward, Jews in occupied Poland were forced into ghettos, walled-off sections of cities where disease and starvation were rampant. In 1941, following the invasion of the Soviet Union, special SS units called Einsatzgruppen began mass shootings of Jews, communists, and others in newly conquered territories. Tens of thousands were killed in mass graves. This was the beginning of what later became known as the Holocaust. By the end of 1941, the war had spread far beyond Europe. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the war. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. The conflict that had begun with the invasion of Poland had now become a truly global war, involving Europe, Asia, Africa, and the oceans of the world. By the end of 1941, Adolf Hitler had achieved territorial control that no German leader before him had ever dreamed of. His armies occupied most of continental Europe, stretching from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow. He had conquered Poland, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. He had allied with Italy and Japan, but by launching the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, and by declaring war on the United States in December 1941, he had also created enemies whose combined resources vastly outmatched those of Germany. What had begun as a series of rapid victories was now becoming a long and exhausting global conflict that Germany could not win. In 1942, the German war machine was still formidable. Millions of soldiers fought across Europe, North Africa, and the Soviet Union. German submarines, called U-boats, prowled the Atlantic Ocean, sinking Allied shipping and threatening Britain's supply lines. German industry, reorganized under Albert Speer, produced tanks, aircraft, and weapons at an impressive pace. Hitler believed that decisive victories could still bring Britain to negotiate peace and the Soviet Union to collapse. But the tide of the war began to turn. In North Africa, German forces under General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, advanced deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, a vital lifeline for Britain. But in October 1942, at the Battle of El Alamein, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery stopped the German advance and pushed them back. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. In the Soviet Union, the turning point came at Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched a massive offensive into southern Russia, aiming to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad, which bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. The battle that followed was one of the deadliest in history. German forces fought street by street, house by house, while Soviet defenders resisted fiercely. The city was reduced to rubble by bombing and artillery, but fighting continued through the winter. In November 1942, the Red Army launched a counteroffensive, encircling the German Sixth Army. Hitler refused to allow them to retreat. By February 1943, the Sixth Army, starving and exhausted, surrendered. More than 300,000 German and Allied soldiers were lost. Stalingrad was a catastrophic defeat, shattering the myth of German invincibility. While the war turned against Germany on the battlefield, Nazi persecution of Jews and other groups escalated into systematic mass murder. In 1942, the Nazi leadership formalized plans for what they called the final solution, the complete extermination of the Jewish population of Europe. At the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, SS officials coordinated the deportation of Jews from across occupied Europe to extermination camps in occupied Poland. Camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno, Majdanek, and Belzec were built or expanded for industrial-scale killing. Victims were transported by train, often in cattle cars, under horrific conditions. On arrival, most were sent directly to gas chambers disguised as showers. Their bodies were burned in crematoria. Between 1942 and 1945, approximately 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, along with millions of others, including Roma, Gypsies, disabled people, political prisoners, and Soviet prisoners of war. The Holocaust remains one of the most systematic and horrific genocides in human history. Hitler himself did not design the technical details of the camps, but he authorized and encouraged the policies that made them possible. On the military front, 1943 and 1944 brought continued defeats for Germany. After Stalingrad, the Red Army went on the offensive, pushing westward. At Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, the Germans attempted to regain the initiative, but were decisively defeated. From then on, the Soviets steadily advanced toward Germany. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Italy, beginning with Sicily and then the mainland. Mussolini's regime collapsed and Italy surrendered, though German troops continued to fight in Italy for the next 2 years. Allied bombing campaigns intensified, targeting German cities and industries. Cities such as Hamburg, Cologne, and later Dresden were devastated by firebombing raids. Civilian casualties mounted, and German morale began to weaken. The decisive moment in the West came on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day. On that morning, Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, landing on the beaches of Normandy in France. American, British, Canadian, and other troops established a foothold and began advancing across Western Europe. Paris was liberated in August 1944. By the end of the year, Allied armies had reached the western borders of Germany. Hitler, by now increasingly isolated, refused to accept reality. He continued to believe in victory through willpower and loyalty. In December 1944, he ordered one last major offensive in the west, the Battle of the Bulge. German forces attacked through the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp. At first, they achieved surprise and pushed deep into Allied lines. But the Allies regrouped, and by January 1945, the offensive had failed. Germany had exhausted its reserves. In the east, the Red Army advanced relentlessly. By January 1945, Soviet troops were on the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. Millions of refugees fled westward in harsh winter conditions. German cities lay in ruins, and supplies of fuel, food, and weapons were running out. Inside Hitler's inner circle, tensions grew. He became increasingly distrustful of his generals, often overruling them and demanding impossible offensives. His health declined, with witnesses noting trembling hands, a stooped posture, and frequent rages. He spent much of his time in his underground bunker in Berlin, shielded from the destruction above. In April 1945, the end came. On April 16, the Soviet Union launched the final assault on Berlin. More than 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surrounded the city. German defenders, including old men and young boys of the Hitler Youth, fought desperately but were overwhelmed. Street by street, block by block, the Red Army closed in. On April 20, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, artillery shells from Soviet guns landed near the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. In his bunker beneath the building, Hitler received a small group of loyal followers. Outside, the city burned. In his final days, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, on April 29. That same day, he dictated his political testament, blaming Jews and the war itself for Germany's defeat, and urging Germans to continue fighting even after his death. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on the Reichstag, only a few hundred meters away, Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to a private room in the bunker. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, Hitler shot himself while Eva Braun took poison. Their bodies were carried upstairs, doused with petrol, and burned in the garden of the Chancellery. The war in Europe ended soon after. On May 7, 1945, Germany unconditionally surrendered to the Allies. The war that Hitler had unleashed had lasted nearly 6 years, drawn in more than 60 nations, and caused the deaths of an estimated 70 to 85 million people, including soldiers and civilians. Europe lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and the world was forever changed. Hitler's life had ended in the bunker beneath a destroyed city, far from the triumph he had once imagined. His rise from obscurity to absolute power, his dictatorship, the devastation of war, and the crimes of the Holocaust left a legacy of destruction unmatched in modern history.